New COO walked into our quarterly review meeting and called our compliance infrastructure a legacy system holding the company back from growth. I remember looking around the room at people who had spent 15, 20 years building that infrastructure from nothing and thinking, she has no idea what she just said. I should back up. I spent 23 years of Meridian Health Systems as their Director of Regulatory Compliance. We operated 6 hospitals across 3 states, Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana, and our entire revenue model depended on Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements. That's not a minor detail. That's approximately $380 million a year flowing through a framework of federal regulations so complex that most people outside healthcare administration don't even know it exists. My job was to know it exists. Every clause, every update, every CMS guidance letter that came down from Washington. I had built our compliance program from a 2-person office into a 14-person department. We had never once failed a Joint Commission survey. Not once in 23 years. I want to be honest about something before I go further. I was not a flashy person. I drove a used Camry. I ate lunch at my desk most days. I had a daughter finishing her master's degree at Ohio State, and a wife who taught 3rd grade and thought my job sounded boring whenever I tried to explain it at dinner. I was exactly the kind of person who is very easy to overlook until the moment you can't afford to overlook them anymore. Her name was my new COO, and she arrived in March with a Stanford MBA, a background in health tech startups, and an absolute certainty that everything we had been doing for 2 decades was inefficient. The first time I met her one-on-one, she spent 40 minutes telling me about streamlining the compliance function and leveraging AI-driven audit tools to replace manual review processes. I asked her which CMS conditions of participation she was planning to automate. She looked at me like I had asked the question in a foreign language. "The specifics aren't important at this stage," she said. "We're thinking big picture." I nodded and wrote nothing down. Over the following 6 weeks, I watched her reorganize the executive team. Our CFO took early retirement. Our chief nursing officer was moved sideways into a newly created patient experience role that had no real authority. And then, one Tuesday morning in April, my assistant told me the COO wanted to see me at 2 o'clock. I already knew. You develop a sense for these things after 2 decades. She sat across from me with a folder she never opened and told me that Meridian was evolving its compliance philosophy and that they were bringing in someone with a fresher perspective on regulatory innovation. I asked who. She paused just a half-second too long and said it was someone with a strong background in healthcare consulting. I found out 3 days later, through the kind of hallway conversation that organizations like ours run entirely on, that the new compliance director was her nephew. 28 years old. He had spent 4 years at a consulting firm that worked mostly with pharmaceutical companies, which is a completely different regulatory universe than hospital Medicare compliance. He had never once dealt with a Joint Commission survey, a CMS conditions of participation audit, or a state health department licensure review. I want to be very clear about something. I was not angry. I was concerned. There is a difference, and the difference matters. I requested a meeting with the CEO. He was a decent man who had been in healthcare finance for 30 years and genuinely believed, I think, that his COO knew what she was doing. He listened to me for 20 minutes. He said he had full confidence in the leadership team's direction. He thanked me for my dedication. I went home that night and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. My wife asked me what was wrong. I told her I thought the hospital system was about to walk into something it didn't understand. "Can you stop it?" she asked. "I don't think they want me to," I said. I gave my formal notice the following Monday. 30 days, professional, thorough. I put together a transition document that was 64 pages long. I documented every active survey cycle, every pending CMS inquiry, every regulatory relationship I had built with state surveyors over 2 decades. I handed it to my nephew, to her nephew, in a 3-hour meeting where he took notes on his laptop and nodded in a way that told me he understood maybe a third of what I was saying. Before I walked out for the last time, I did one thing. Not revenge. Documentation. I sent a formal written notification to our CMS Federal Regional Liaison, the specific individual in our regional CMS office who managed Meridian's provider agreements, informing them that I was departing the organization and that a transition in the compliance director role was underway. This was not unusual. This was not aggressive. This is literally standard protocol under 42 CFR Part 489. When a hospital system has a significant change in compliance leadership, the responsible party is supposed to notify their CMS liaison. I did it because it was the right thing to do. I want to be clear about that. I did not do it to cause problems. I did it because the regulations require it, and because I had spent 23 years being the person who followed the regulations. I started my own consulting practice the following week. I had 3 former colleagues who had reached out to me over the years about potential work, and I called all 3 of them in the first 48 hours. By the end of my first month, I had 2 clients. By the end of my second month, I had 4. I was charging $340 an hour and working from a home office that my wife decorated with a plant she named Gerald. I was not thinking about Meridian. Meridian, however, was apparently thinking about me. The first indication came from a former colleague who called me in late June, about 8 weeks after I left. She was a compliance coordinator I had hired 7 years earlier and one of the sharper people I had ever worked with. She told me, carefully and without much detail, that the Nephew had made some changes to the audit schedule. What kind of changes? I asked. He moved the internal audit cycles to quarterly instead of monthly, she said, and he eliminated the pre-survey readiness reviews. I stayed quiet for a moment. For all 6 facilities? I said. For all 6, she said. I thanked her and hung up. I sat at my desk and stared at Gerald the plan for a while. Pre-survey readiness reviews are not optional best practices. They are how a hospital system catches problems before federal surveyors do. Monthly internal audits are not paranoia. They are the mechanism by which a large health system maintains continuous compliance with conditions that can change with relatively little notice. Eliminating both of those things simultaneously at a 6-hospital system was not streamlining. It was removing the early warning system entirely. I thought about calling someone. I thought about it for several days. But I'd been told clearly that my perspective was no longer needed, and I'd left a 64-page transition document that explained exactly why these practices existed. In August, one of our facilities, the hospital in Dayton, had a routine CMS survey. These surveys happen on a rolling cycle. They are unannounced. Surveyors show up, they spend 3 to 5 days on site, they review documentation, they interview staff, they observe practices. If they find conditions of participation deficiencies, they issue a statement of deficiencies and the hospital has to respond with a plan of correction. If they find immediate jeopardy, meaning a deficiency that is already caused or is likely to cause serious harm to patients, the consequences are different. Federal law requires CMS to move toward termination of the provider agreement if immediate jeopardy is not removed within a very short time frame. Termination of the provider agreement means the hospital can no longer bill Medicare or Medicaid. For the Dayton facility, Medicare and Medicaid represented roughly 61% of revenue. I found out what happened the same way I found out everything, from a former colleague who called me and spoke very carefully. The survey had found deficiencies in 3 different conditions of participation, including one that was cited at the immediate jeopardy level. The deficiency involved medication management protocols that had been revised without proper documentation and staff training verification. The kind of thing a monthly internal audit would have caught 4 months earlier. CMS issued this statement of deficiencies on a Thursday. The hospital had until the following Wednesday to submit an acceptable plan of correction or face the beginning of termination proceedings. I was told the next part secondhand, but from 2 separate people who were in the room. The COO called an emergency leadership meeting on Friday morning. She was looking for someone to present the plan of correction response and manage the CMS relationship going forward. Her nephew said he would handle it. Someone in that room. I was told it was the CFO, the new CFO, who had been brought in from the tech sector and also had no hospital background, asked a simple question. They asked who the CMS Federal Regional Liaison was for Meridian's accounts and whether they had been in communication with them recently. Nobody in the room knew the answer. That was the moment, I'm told, when my COO's face changed. Because when they pulled the file, they found my notification for May. They found that I had followed protocol. They found that the liaison had acknowledged my notification and noted the leadership transition in Meridian's account record. They also found that no one from Meridian had followed up with the liaison in the 8 weeks since, which meant the liaison was aware that the compliance function had turned over at a major 6-hospital system and had not heard a single word from the new leadership. CMS regional offices noticed things like that. They also found something else in the file. When my notification had gone in, the liaison had responded with a standard acknowledgement and had included a reminder that Meridian's current Medicare provider agreement was up for routine renewal review in the fourth quarter. That reminder had been sent to my email address, which I no longer had access to. Nobody had set up a forwarding system. Nobody had thought to check what communications might have been routed to my account. The renewal review had a deadline. The deadline was 10 weeks out. I want to pause here and be honest about my reaction when I learned all of this because I think it matters. I did not feel satisfied. Not exactly. I felt something closer to what I imagine a structural engineer feels when a building fails in the exact way they warned it might fail. It is not a good feeling. There are real people in that building. 6 hospitals. Thousands of employees, hundreds of thousands of patients across 3 states who depended on those facilities being operational. My former colleague who called me asked very quietly if I would be willing to consult. I told her I would need to think about it. I thought about it for one evening. My wife asked me what I was going to do. I told her I wasn't sure it was my responsibility anymore. She looked at me in a way that she has been looking at me for 28 years, which communicates clearly and without any words that she knows exactly who I am and what I'm going to do. I called back the next morning. My consulting rate for crisis response was $500 an hour. I am not ashamed of that number. Specialized knowledge under time pressure has a market value, and the market had just made itself very clear. I spent the next 6 weeks essentially living in my former office. Not my office, I was a consultant now, so I sat in a conference room on the 4th floor with a laptop and a stack of regulatory manuals I had brought from home. The nephew, to his credit, was smart enough to stay out of my way. He asked me questions when he had them and took the answers without defensiveness. He was not a bad person. He was simply a 28-year-old who had been put in a position that required 23 years of experience. We submitted the plan of correction on Tuesday. It was accepted. We got the provider agreement renewal documentation in on time. The Dayton facility came off immediate jeopardy status after a resurvey in September. When it was over, the CEO called me into his office. He sat across from me and he looked tired in the way that people look when something has frightened them badly enough to age them a little. He asked me if I would consider coming back. I told him I appreciated the offer. I told him I'd built a consulting practice, that I had clients who were counting on me. I told him I was happy to continue as an external compliance consultant for Meridian at my current rate, and that I would recommend a very specific structure for their internal compliance department going forward, and that I would put all of it in writing. He agreed to everything. I found out later, through the kind of number that tends to circulate in healthcare administration circles, that the Dayton situation had cost Meridian approximately $4.2 million in emergency remediation, consultant fees, legal costs, and the revenue impact from 2 elective procedure service lines that had been temporarily suspended during the immediate jeopardy period. That number did not include the cost of the provider agreement renewal process, which had required outside legal counsel and additional CMS engagement because the account relationship had been allowed to go dormant. The COO resigned in October. I did not hear this directly. My former colleague sent me a text message that said only, "She's gone." I read it twice and put my phone down and went back to the contract I was reviewing for a hospital system in Tennessee. The nephew stayed on, reporting now to an interim compliance director they brought in from outside. He called me once, a few months later, to ask a question about survey readiness. I answered it. I gave him the name of a good training program. I told him the work was harder than it looked, but that it mattered, and that if he put in the time to actually learn it, he would be good at it. He thanked me. He sounded like he meant it. My daughter came home for Thanksgiving that year and asked me how work was going. I told her it had been an interesting 12 months. She asked what that meant. "It means I spent 23 years building something," I said, "and when they took it away from me, I found out it was mine the whole time." She looked at me like that didn't quite make sense. My wife from across the kitchen laughed. I think about that year sometimes, when I'm reviewing documentation for a new client or sitting in on a pre-survey readiness meeting. The kind of meeting I still insist on, that I have always insisted on, that no one ever wants to schedule until the surveyors are already in the parking lot. You can replace a person. You can put a different name on an office door. You can call 23 years of institutional knowledge a legacy system and tell yourself that fresh eyes see things more clearly. But the regulations don't care about your org chart. The federal requirements exist independent of whoever is sitting in the compliance director's chair. And the work, the real work, the unglamorous, desk lunch, 64-page transition document work either gets done or it doesn't. It turned out the consequences of it not getting done were written down in the Code of Federal Regulations all along. Nobody had to do anything. The rules just kept being the rules. There's a version of this story where I'm the hero. I walked out. The system punished them. I came back at twice the rate and fixed everything they broke. Clean arc. Satisfying ending. But that's not actually what I think about when I look back on that year. What I think about is the 64-page transition document. I think about the 3 hours I spent walking my replacement through frameworks he didn't yet have the experience to fully understand, knowing the whole time that he probably wouldn't be able to use them. Not because he wasn't capable, but because capability takes time and nobody had given him that time. I did that anyway, not because anyone asked me to, not because it protected me legally or professionally. I did it because the work mattered and the patience at the end of that work mattered, and some things are simply worth doing right even when you're being shown the door. That's the part of the story I think is actually worth something. I spent a long time in my career watching people confuse credentials with competence and title with knowledge. My COO had both credentials and a title. What she didn't have was an honest accounting of what she didn't know. That gap between what you believe you understand and what you actually understand is where most disasters live, and in regulated industries, in healthcare, in any field where the rules exist because people's lives depend on them, that gap has a specific and measurable cost. The regulations caught what overconfidence missed. That's not fate. That's not the universe balancing a moral ledger. That's just how systems built on accountability actually function when nobody is manipulating them. The Code of Federal Regulations does not have favorites. It doesn't care who hired whose nephew. It applies the same standard to everyone, and if you don't meet it, the consequences are already written down in advance. I've thought about what I would tell someone younger who finds themselves where I was, pushed out by someone who couldn't see what they were pushing out. And I think what I'd say is this: the protection is in the work itself, not in politics, not in visibility, not in making sure the right people know your name. The protection is in building something real enough that its absence becomes immediately legible to the systems that depend on it. That requires honesty about what you know and what you don't. It requires the discipline to do the unglamorous things, the monthly audits, the pre-survey reviews, the 64-page documents that nobody reads until everything goes wrong. And it requires, maybe most importantly, the steadiness to keep doing the right thing when the organization around you has stopped rewarding it. My wife put a plant in my home office. I consulted from that room for months while Meridian sorted out the consequences of a decision I had no power to stop. Gerald, the plant is still alive, which I consider a minor victory. The work I built over 23 years turned out to be mine in a way no org chart change could touch. That's the thing about real expertise. You can move a name off a door. You can't move what that name knew.